This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Shemot series, First Principles of Nationhood, where we're exploring what axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are. How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? This week's episode has been sponsored by Michelle Fagelin and Debbie Nussbaum in loving memory of their father, Nathan Werdiger, Natan ben Shlomo Elimelech Udvora. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor more Shemot episodes. Parshat Vaera opens with God assuring Moshe that he will be present and help the people despite the current overload of their slave responsibilities. Moshe is sent to the people to assure them, but he isn't successful. His initial faltering confidence is certainly not strengthened by these initial bumps. After this, we read a genealogical list which claims to detail the descendants of Yaakov, but which really focuses on the Levite family tree. This list provides further support for Moshe and Aaron's leadership position. While the people are currently unconvinced that salvation will be delivered through them, the reader is informed that the success will eventually arise from this family. And then we meet the plague's opening act. Aaron performs a sign for Paro when he turns his staff into a tanin. While the magicians can perform the same wonder, Aaron's staff then swallows theirs, reflecting the ultimate power of God. But even this impressive feat does not move Paro, and God proceeds with the plagues program. This week's parsha includes the first 7 plagues. In past years, we focused on the purpose of the plagues, their internal logic, and I encourage you to return to those previous episodes on this parsha, which include episode 92 and 147. But today we'll be doing something different. But right before we get to that, I want to share with you that this is our 200th podcast episode. And I really wanted to take a moment to thank all of you, our devoted listeners, who stick with us each week. I want to also thank those who have donated by name and behind the scenes to this project and make this a platform that also commemorates your special events. And I also wanted to include a special thank you to those who have helped me on the creative side of things. So much of the Matan staff, Chaya Bina Katz, Dr. Yael Ziegler, Esti Bina, and others, as well as our awesome editing team and recording staff, Yardena and Dana. This weekly community meets because of all of you, and so thank you so much for being part of it. Today, I am honored to welcome back to the podcast the esteemed Rabbi Joshua Berman, who is a professor of Bible studies at Bar-Ilan University and who frequently lectures at Matan Beit Shemesh. He is the author of multiple books on Tanakh, and of course, he's been on this podcast, and I quote him very often, such as Created Equal, How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought, which will be the basis of today's conversation, Narrative Analogy in the Hebrew Bible, Battle Stories and their equivalent non-battle narratives, Inconsistency in the Torah, Ancient Literary Convention and the Limits of Source Criticism, Ani Ma'amin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith, a commentary in the book of Echa, which we had our own podcast episode about. And excitingly, Rabbi Berman told me that he is currently working on a special Egypt Haggadah, which Be'ezrat Hashem you'll be able to find in the coming year or two, where he's going to include all of the vast knowledge that he's amassed about ancient Egypt and how that really sheds light on the Torah. And Rabbi Berman, it is an absolute pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Yosefa, and I'm really honored to be here as your 200th guest. And I wish you should go Michael from strength to strength, you and this podcast and this whole community.
Really, really appreciate it. And I reached out to you for this episode because, as I said in the introduction, I'm really trying to pull back a bit in these Shemot episodes and go back to sort of these first principles. And I think that while that's not the language you've used in plenty of your research, for me, very often that is a lot of times the outcome of some of what's come out, of really being able to learn about the Torah in the context it was given, and very often enables us to really uncover what really sits at the root, sort of like it's what sits at the root of the Torah, and what really the Torah came and revolutionized about the world. And very often those really are our first principles. And it was maybe taking ideas and themes and beliefs that existed in the ancient world and really shifting them. And sometimes they were just completely new ideas that the Torah really brought, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought to the world. So today, with that sort of brief introduction in mind, I really wanted you to help us get through sort of this idea that you've written a book about and more, about this idea of egalitarianism. In your writing, you really claim that the Torah comes and does something utterly revolutionary. Some of this has to do directly with our stories in the book of Shemot, and of course, some of it goes beyond that. But I'd love if you could sort of walk us through a brief summary of what you mean by egalitarianism and what is so important about the Tanakh. Why did the Tanakh want to revolutionize this idea?
Right. So I know that when you put together in the same sentence, oh, the Torah is the birthplace of egalitarianism, a lot of people are like, what? I mean, there are many wonderful ideas in the Torah, but one would not automatically say that egalitarianism is one of them. There's obviously differences between men and women, between Kohanim priests and non-Kohanim, non-priests, between kings and everybody else. And the basic idea comes down to this. I want us to think for a moment of what we all know about the culture that is described in the stories of Joseph. What you see there is a society, a culture that is deeply hierarchical and stratified. There's a pharaoh, there's a Potiphar, and there are a whole bunch of slaves underneath. And if you're born a pharaoh, then you will remain a pharaoh. And if you're born a Potiphar, someone with a lot of land, etc., part of the landed gentry, that's where you're going to spend your entire life. And if you're a slave, that's where you're going to spend your entire life, unless you're Yosef and you have God on your side. But he's the exception that proves the rule. This notion that society was hierarchical and stratified was the way in which the entire ancient world was constructed. Nobody ever had the slightest inkling of anything that we would term equality or social mobility. And it wasn't just because they were stupid or not creative enough. It's because they would have considered such an idea as heretical, that the only way in which society can function in an orderly fashion is if people know their place. And only when people know their place and stay in that place, then that is how society will work and will function properly. And what I believe the Torah tries to do is to create the first blueprint that we have in the history of political thought that seeks to dilute power from those that had it, such as kings, such as the wealthy, such as priests who lorded over enormous amounts of economic resources in the ancient world, and to instead of having power up there, to bring power down to the people and to empower the common person. And this is what I mean by a kind of an egalitarian streak, to dilute power from the top and to empower those that are down below.
And so what are some examples within the Torah that you see that coming through? Meaning, because as you said, al panav, there is a certain degree of hierarchy, right? Whether it's gender hierarchy or priestly hierarchy, which I actually want to come back to that later. Mm-hmm. But what are some of the examples that you think are really the most salient to prove this idea?
Oh, well, the most salient is how the Torah views political office, especially about kings. Kings in the ancient Near East were in charge of everything. They were in charge of the army. They were in charge of justice. They wrote the laws. They were obviously in charge of warfare. And they were the focal point of society and the focal point of the gods. Nowhere else in the ancient world do you have gods who speak to the whole people. Along comes the Torah and tells us that, well, first of all, maybe it's even better if you don't have a king. It's kind of lukewarm how Sefer Dvarim speaks about a king. In Chazal, it turns out to be a mitzvah to have a king. But when you read, Dvarim Perek Yud Zayin, the 17th chapter of Deuteronomy, it is not clear that the Torah is saying you have to have a king. It's almost like, well, okay, if you want to have a king, then this is how you go about doing it. But what you see there is almost a parody of kingship in ancient Near Eastern terms. What does the king do? The Torah doesn't say what a king does. All the Torah that says is what a king cannot do. Cannot have wives. He cannot have excessive taxation, right? Kesev is a hab lo yarbelo, to have excessive gold and silver. He can't have excessive horses. Nowhere else in the ancient world were kings limited in what they could do. In fact, when the Torah does get to kind of describe what kingship is like, "V'haya kishivto al kisei mamlachto," when the king will sit on his mighty throne, and there's kind of shades there of Esther, appearing before Achashverosh, and you have that sense of the king there in Esther sitting on his mighty throne. What does the Torah say? Oh, and then the Kohanim and will read him, the Kohanim and the Zkanim, the priests and the elders, will read to him the Torah that he has to write for himself that limits him in all these ways. The idea that kingship could be theoretically to anybody, because the Torah says that the king can be mikerev achecha, that means anybody in Israel, or perhaps I should say any male in Israel, but that's still a lot relative to what it was elsewhere in the ancient world, and that it's not automatically given to a particular family, a particular office. Never in the ancient world, anywhere, was there a notion of political office that was open to everybody. This is a very modern notion that we have of running for office. You can run for office, I can run for office. This really only begins with the American founding fathers, but before that, throughout history, political office was always from the get-go pre-assigned to a family, to a caste, to a certain economics segment in society. The Torah is the first document that we have that says, you know what? Really anybody theoretically can be the king. So that we have here a dilution of royal power. Nowhere, the Am Yisrael are not allowed to have a king before they conquer Eretz Yisrael, which is precisely when they would want to have one, because if you're going out to the battlefield, you got to have a king in front of you. So we take that away as well. And so what we see is that the whole variety of ways in which kingship is attenuated, and it's almost a parody there. And a lot of the kingly prerogatives are given over to the people. So that's like a prime example of it. And I think that that's not only in Sefer Dvarim. This is right here in our Sefer, in Sefer Shemot. The plagues are not just to demonstrate God's power; they are to demonstrate the powerlessness of the kings. And that's why a lot of the makot focus on in your house and in your oven and in your bedroom, your people, your land. This is a huge polemic against kingship.
Right. And of course, the first 9 plagues almost don't do the job. And then the 10th plague does. And the 10th plague is really that showdown between Paro as king. Right. There's no one left. The people have kind of left him. His sorcerers have kind of left him. And you're left there in that last moment with this big showdown between God and Paro. And I mean, the winner is obvious. You also, though, speak about this idea when it comes to Brit Sinai, when it comes to the fact that the covenant is made with everybody, which in and of itself, right, is also really a very new idea. And this one, by the way, does go across gender lines, meaning men, women, and children.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Look, when we read these parsha, we say, "Wow, boy, God did that. God did this miracle, this plague, splitting this body of water." If you had said that to anyone in the ancient world, they would say, "Yeah, that's what gods do. Our gods also, we believe our gods do those sorts of things too." If you had said to someone in the ancient world outside of Israel, "Our God speaks to all of us," they would have gone, "Really? Really? To all the people? Like, that's so weird. It's not a godlike thing to do. Our God only speaks to the kings through prophets sometimes." So the idea that we are the focus is a radically new idea. The very fact, Yosef, this is just something that everybody needs to know. Okay, what I'm going to say now. Everybody needs to know that Am Yisrael is the first group, the first nation, ethnicity in the entire history of man to have a written history of itself, or even an oral history of itself. Let me explain what I mean by that.
I mean, other nations had documents, but you're saying a history in terms of that it starts early and continues on further?
No. I mean, a consciousness of, yes, well, we are from forefathers, and first this happened to them, and then this happened to them, and then this happened to them, and now here we are. Ancient cultures did not have such a notion. They couldn't have told you what happened 200 years or 300 years earlier. Nothing. They had myths about, how the world was created. But there's no recorded history that they have. There's no history that they pass down. And there's certainly no history that they pass down that has God involved in it. Human history is not a plane on which the gods act in the ancient world. Meaning, yes,
because the people weren't important. They weren't important enough.
Yeah, in other words, they would say, "Oh, of course, yes. The gods helped us achieve this great victory over our enemies." But that was never something that they recorded for posterity and passed down and had a consciousness. Oh, yes, hundreds of years ago, our gods helped our people emerge victorious over our enemy. No, no, they just didn't have that. They just didn't have that. So the idea that God is involved in history and gives an historical mission to a people, or attaches any significance to their history. This is entirely a creation of the Torah. And I guess it really starts with Adam Arishon, but it certainly starts in terms of a national history here in Sefer Shemot.
Okay, so one question I also have is sort of the notion of Tzelem Elokim. Do you include that? I mean, that's somewhat more of almost like a universal idea. But is the idea of Tzelem Elokim that exists in every person, as opposed to, I know in other ancient cultures only the king was described as someone who was a mirror image of God? Do you think that's part of this same idea?
Look, what I know is that at least in ancient Egypt, the idea of being created in the image of God. Yeah, I guess the pharaohs to some degree are right. And this is now expanded in the Torah to include all people. Yeah.
Meaning part of what I think might support this idea that everybody has worth, that everybody, will stop short of rights, which is a modern idea, but that everybody has worth.
Yeah.
Really starts with this idea that everybody's imbued with a certain degree of godliness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And what about, this idea sort of turns the Torah into a political document as well. And I'm curious if you could maybe reflect on that, meaning we tend to look at the Torah through the lens of a religious lens, but I think that this idea really comes to say that the Torah has what to say about politics, or maybe even economic systems, right? If you look also at land systems, which also, again, not open to all genders within the Torah, but also are far more broad-reaching and inclusive than other ancient systems, and not even such ancient systems. So right, how would how does that fit into the way that you look at the Torah?
Yeah, exactly. The Torah is the first blueprint for a society that takes away power from the powerful and gives it to the powerless, or gives it to the populace. Look, you can see this. The Torah has a very carefully reasoned economic plan. Now, you might think, well, what parsha was that? I don't remember Parshat Kalkala, the economic parsha. It works like this. In the ancient world, we need to just think again about the Yosef stories. What do you see there in Yosef? You see that a famine comes along, and now everybody has to sell everything they own to get a few morsels to eat. All the money rises to the top, and all the people sink to the bottom and become slaves. This would happen all over the world, and it's not surprising that it happens even at least another 2 times in the Tanakh. You see this during the siege of Babylon in Jeremiah 34. Where this is exactly what happens. The people are in Jerusalem and they're starving, and everybody sells everything to the rich, and all the money floats to the top, and all the people sink to the bottom and become slaves. It happens also in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so and this was a problem that was known the world over. And it's very hard. Once you sell off everything, then you have no way of making any money, right? Because you've sold your donkey, and you've sold your land, you've probably sold your children too, and you've sold yourself. So how do you get out of this? This was a big problem. And so what the Torah has an economic plan that is aimed directly towards this issue. When times are good, then people get by. They farm a little bit, they have a couple of sheep or chickens, and they put a little bit on the table from what they've been able to grow and to sell, and things are good. There's obviously no savings plans, and there's no insurance, and there's not even a freezer to keep food fresh. And so when things get bad because of famine, or because of war, or because of siege, or because of disease, then things go bad very quickly, and you get to the type of situation that we have in the Yosef stories of everyone having to sell everything off. The money rises to the top, and the people sink to the bottom. The Torah has a well-defined economic plan, and its first plank has to do with something we're all familiar with, but we've never thought about. We've only thought about it maybe in religious terms, but not in economic terms. And that has to do with hitnachaluyot, that each shevet, each tribe, gets its own allotment, and then that allotment is then divvied up amongst all the families in the tribe. I suspect most of us would say, why does the Torah do that? Well, because Eretz Yisrael is a Yerusha. It's an inheritance. This was given to the Avot, right? To Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then, like every inheritance, in the second generation, it gets cut up a little bit, and then the third, a little more. And then after a few generations, the slices are very small, but everyone gets a little slice. That is true. That's not untrue. But there's an economic logic to this too, and that is that for the first time in history, almost, I would say, maybe almost the only time in history, with one exception that I'll mention in a minute, that a culture decides, you know what, let's take all of our land and give it to the people. That never happened before. And it really only happened afterwards, to the best of my knowledge, in 1860 in the United States, in the Homestead Act, where after the United States had killed off all the Indians, there was all this land that was just sitting there. And so the U.S. government said, go west, young man. That's where it comes from. And you will have, we'll give you a whole bunch of acres of land. If you're able to survive several harsh winters, then it's going to be yours. But that aside, this had never happened before. I mean, this is taking real economic resources and just giving it out to the common people. And then when we say, and then we're going to make sure that it stays that way, because in the Yovel year, in the Jubilee year, if you've had, if you've had to sell your land because of difficulties that you've encountered, then it's going to go back to you. And so we're going to ensure that you have a way of getting back up on your feet. That's the most significant of the planks, and there's some others if you want me to go on in that direction.
Okay, so I guess I do want to ask one further question in this regard, which is that if we could compare it to modern economic systems, what system would you suggest that the Torah supports the most?
I would say what you see here is the invention of a notion of a social safety net. Right, the fact that in the Yovel year the lands go back to the original owner, the fact that in the Shemitah year, in the sabbatical year, debts are canceled. In the ancient world, the way they dealt with this problem of people, sinking to the bottom and all becoming slaves when times went bad, what they did was this. It was remarkable. It was the same solution from Mihodu Vad Kush, from east to west, and it worked like this: a king would rise to the throne, a new king. The first thing he would do is debt relief. He would cancel all debts. That did two things for the king. A, the people loved the king. What a great king! We're so happy he's our king now, and we're happy to pay him taxes, and we're happy to go to war for him. And it also weakened all of the very rich landowners who had all this money coming to them. Who, when they get to when the rich get too powerful, then they begin to impinge upon the power of the king. So this served double duty for those kings. The problem was, if you were poor and you had lost all your belongings, you never knew when there was going to be a new king. Along comes the Torah and tweaks this in what we call Shmitat Ksafim, which is the annulment of debt in the Shemitah year. What the Torah says, we're not going to make this a political football for the king that helps the new king gain power. We're going to tell people, listen, just hold on another 2, 3, 4 years, and you'll be able to get debt relief from Shemitah. So that's another plank of the social safety net. The fact that we don't charge interest on loans is another aspect of this. The fact that the Torah has a very lenient system of taxes, what we call trumot and masrot, which were a small fraction of what people had to pay the kings in the temples in the ancient world. The Torah wants the common person to hold on to the produce that they have worked hard to produce.
There definitely are socialistic elements, but we also couldn't look at the Torah and says that it is, breeds a pure form of capitalism. Meaning it seems to be that there's a sort of elements of both that are making their way into the system.
That's correct. It definitely encourages us to work hard, and at the same time to incorporate for the first time a social safety net. I think one of the most amazing things about this, and I have to say this, and it also has to do with Sefer Shemot, what I find amazing about the Torah's economic plan has to do with its recalibration of time. We measure time differently than any other culture does. Let me explain how that is. In the ancient world, everybody had a calendar, but they measured 3 units of time: years, months, and days. They didn't do weeks. They did years and months and days because those are all functions of astronomic activity, the moon and the sun. But weeks are an artifice. Nothing natural. Not the year, not the moon, not the month. Divide evenly by 7, and obviously the 7 comes from Maaseh Breshit. And what you see when the Torah describes Shabbat in its many places, and when it describes the 7th year in several places, and when it discusses the Yovel year after 7 Shemitah cycles, time and time again, what is emphasized is not so much Maaseh Breshit, creation, but rather you are going to rest, and all of your dependents are going to rest like you rest. What the Torah is doing is creating these gaps in time where there will be no economic activity. Because, it's just remarkable. When we meet a new person for the first time, almost instinctively, without thinking about it, so what do you do? When I say that to you, what do you do? What I'm really asking is, what is your place in the economic order? Isn't that a strange question for a Jew to ask another Jew? What do you do?
It's a particularly American question. I just want to put that out there.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, there's studies done on that. Yeah, like Europeans don't ask that question in their first, I think, 5 social questions that they ask somebody, and Israelis are closer to Europeans on that. But I just wanted to throw that out there.
So interesting.
It's really interesting. It's fascinating.
I didn't know that. Okay. Yeah. Well, since many of our listeners are probably American, they have fallen into the same trap that I have. What the Torah wants to make sure is that there are these gaps in time when we're not thinking about each other in economic terms, but rather we're thinking each other in covenantal terms. On Shabbat, you're not supposed to talk about what you do and what you make, how much you're making, et cetera, et cetera. It's what you're learning and what are we doing for the community, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that that's also part of the Torah's economic plan. It's to set up time itself in a way that is liberating and redeeming.
No, that's a really fascinating idea. I think I also want to come back to that, but I just want to tie up a thread that I asked about earlier, which is this part about looking at the Torah as a document that has political elements. Meaning, for some of us listening, that's an obvious. But I just want to state maybe the less obvious, which is that for so many years we weren't flexing the muscles of the Torah on their political and economic realms, and we were really looking at it only through its religious prism. Now, of course, we're aware of the complexity of trying to, bring this to life in the modern state of Israel. And of course, there are many elements that just aren't brought to life at all. Some that there are still interesting people trying to work about, how to go about this, still trying to figure out how to bring principles of Shmitat Ksafim to modern Israeli banks. Like these are works in progress, and some of them are not in progress at all. But I think that the question of, is the Torah a political document as well, which is a question that was engaged with, meaning whether it's, your writing, there are other writings also, Yoram Chazoni, when he came out, really tried to rally very seriously around the idea of the Torah as a political document. I sort of feel like we often would relegate that to like Megillat Esther because it was sort of farther removed, but we lost the identity, we lost seeing the Torah through the prism of the identity of really having an economic statement, of having a statement, a political statement, when now we're reckoning with, if we want to have that religious lens, how do we involve that in the state of Israel today? It's not a simple bridge to create, but I think that the point itself is really significant because we sort of lost that prism throughout many years in exile without sovereignty.
Yeah, for sure. I think that I actually don't think it's that difficult. Yes, the actual implementation of this halacha, etc. How do you do it today? Maybe that's a difficult dance to master. But I think the basic intuitive impulse that we are a people, that we are meant to be in our land, that we are meant to exercise to some degree power over the land, and that expresses itself economically and militarily, etc. The only real guide, touchstones that we have to guide us are the stories in Tanakh, because Chazal, for the most part, are speaking about the life of the community and the life of the individual, and less so the life of the nation, because the life of the nation, for Chazal, being spread out over the 4 corners of the world, was really much more of an abstract concept. And so I think that many Israelis just naturally are attracted to what the Tanakh has to say about this stuff.
I want to sort of go back for a little bit to the Egypt story. We've had conversations about Egypt in the past and bringing some of those elements to life and really seeing them through the prism of the Torah. And I guess I'm also curious, sort of, if in the recent years there's been more that's come to light for you regarding ancient Egypt that maybe could also shed light on our current parshiot. I think that you first mentioned this piece now about time. Time itself is highly significant, and there really is no parallel in the ancient world. But I think that I'm curious if even ideas about immortality in ancient Egypt, how that might also, to a certain degree, perhaps relate to some of these ideas that we're speaking about.
Yeah. This is such a blowaway idea. It's by I read this by a really prominent Egyptologist named Dian Asman, and he points out the following. I think all of us at some point struggle with the idea of mortality. That at some point it just ends. It just ends. And I think that all humans have to have a way of somehow grappling with that. Egyptians had their way, and we have our way. The way Egyptians dealt with the challenge of mortality was to basically deny that it exists. How do you deny that it exists when you have people dying every day? Because there's an afterlife. And when they spoke about an afterlife, let me say, and I hope that I'm not offending anybody by saying this, we have a notion of an olam haba, we talk about it. It's in our sources. But to be honest, we don't focus so much on olam haba. I can't remember the last time I heard anyone speak about preparing for olam haba. I know it's in the books. It's in the books. You can find the lines here.
It's in much later books, and that's very significant.
Yes,
we do not have olam haba in the Torah.
Right. Very hard to find it. Very hard to find it. Egyptians believed in the afterlife the way you and I believe in tomorrow. It's that real. It's that. Now you could say, how do you know there's going to be a tomorrow? But we have our plans. Everything is set. We just expect it to be as palpable and real as yesterday was and as today is, and that's how Egyptians viewed the afterlife. So we exist in this mode here, and then tomorrow, that is after death, then there's another mode, and it's as real and palpable for us as tomorrow is. Okay, it's not just the way we think about olam haba. Olam haba, we don't quite know exactly where it is and what it is. We don't want to denigrate it, chas v'chalila, God forbid. But I'm telling you, they had a much more palpable view of the afterlife. Okay, that's how they dealt with it. How do we deal with mortality? And the answer is this: it goes back to what I said before, that we are in a covenantal relationship with God, and that means that over time, God is constantly involved in the historical progress of the Jewish people. This means that no matter what I'm doing, as long as I am investing myself in contributing to Klal Yisrael, then I am involved in something that is eternal. And especially through the production of my children. By creating children who are also going to be part of this eternal covenant with God, that is how we overcome. Not overcome, but it's how our own mortality is mitigated, because we're involved in an eternal endeavor. I'll bring an actual something that's from an Egyptian inscription that just blows me away. There's one of the pharaohs, Ramses VI. Doesn't matter. He lived, I don't know, probably roughly in the time of the Shoftim, the judges. And there's an inscription about him where the gods say to him, "Oh, mighty king, may you have years that are like the stars in the sky, and may you have jubilees of rain that are like the sands of the sea." Okay? Like the stars in the sky and the sands in the sea. And this is how your reign should go on for eternity. Partly in this world, and then in the afterlife. Okay, now what do we see? That dual metaphor of stars in the sky, as numerous as stars in the sky, and as numerous as those grains of sand at the sea. This is what we find is told to Avram Avinu in the Akedah, but it's said to him not about his years of rule, but about his progeny, about his descendants. And it's not that all women in Israel are going to have 25 children. The reason that Am Yisrael are going to be like the stars in the sky and the sand at the sea is because they are eternal. the Torah, which is given to a group of people coming out of bondage of Egypt, it takes these metaphors, which were part of Egyptian culture, to describe how long pharaohs would reign, and it is appropriated and now applied to the way in which we achieve eternity, which is through the propagation of descendants who, like ourselves, are involved in covenantal relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu.
Yeah, and I don't think that it at all undermines this sort of identity that we've said the Torah really gives everybody this identity, or sort of their own. Everybody has this ability to have this presence and have a relationship with God. But what's interesting is that when we think about ourselves as connected to a broader chain, we are downplaying the significance of, I think, of each individual. Meaning, often I actually find it very comforting that, meaning this, you're becoming part of a broader chain, and so you have a part in it, but you're sort of zooming out and sort of seeing yourself as part of something much bigger. And so you still obviously are your own individual person, and the Torah recognizes that, and you have your own relationship with God, and you have that covenant, but you're part of something that's much larger. And so I feel like in that moment, there's a very beautiful fusing of the individual contribution with the collective hybrid of what we all are creating together in a community. I just have to tell you something. I have to share something. I listened to this episode 2 days ago of, I listen pretty regularly to, honestly, Barry Weiss's podcast. And there was an episode called How Not to Die in 2025. I cannot believe, because I'm a big health person, which does not at all make its way in this podcast. I don't know if people really know that, but it's like a whole part of my life that is very impactful on the way my family grows up. But maybe another day I'll have a podcast on that topic. But I cannot believe I never heard of him. This guy's name is Brian Johnson. And I just want to say that he literally has started a movement. The movement is called Don't Die. Okay. And his basic, and he said, he doesn't deny that maybe it's going to be like a new religion or a cult, or we can just call it a movement. And basically he is using himself as a human guinea pig, and following tons of biomarkers on his body, using his body as basically science, using all the technology that is available today to try and figure out how he can elongate his life. Okay. Now there's no judgment here on what he's doing. Really, I found it fascinating. The conversation, though, was fascinating because it really got to the philosophical roots of, what is the point of doing that? Meaning maybe we don't really want to achieve that. Maybe our goal is not to live, forever. And this question, and he basically was saying that in the world of AI, a lot of the notions we have of what life is supposed to be have sort of flown out the window. Now, for a religious person who's ascribing to, the Torah, I obviously think that there are ideas that are going to be more everlasting than anything that someone in 2025 is going to think of. But I thought it was really fascinating because for me, it really connected with this idea. It was the opposite of the afterlife. It was saying, I don't need an afterlife. I'm going to make this life the permanent one, which I think is a totally different ethos that we see in the modern world, where people really want to remain youthful. They want to, maintain the life that they have now, even though obviously the overall health in the world has really deteriorated. But I thought this was fascinating as a sort of like coming in parallel with some of these Egypt parshiot.
I would wish him I'd Me'av Esrim, but I don't think he wants that.
No, he wants much more than Me'av Esrim. Right now, his projected age is between 80 and 90, but he has a lot of faith that it's going to go far beyond that. At any rate, fascinating conversation. I felt very challenged by it, which is always, to me, the best goal of podcast conversations. I wanted to bring this idea a little, just sort of further in the modern world. By modern, I mean sort of almost pre-modern. But can you just walk us through a little bit of where some of these ideas, how they impact the broader culture in the world? Meaning where we see sort of early philosophers, how they take up some of these ideas as well.
Well, sure. I mean, just to take American history, a lot of the founding fathers, as they were writing documents to, like the Federalist Papers and things like that, and various manifests that they wrote to promote independence. One of the things that was really key for them was, that the Torah has, I would say, a very suspicious view of royal power generally, right? There are no kings that, just very few that are totally righteous and get everything right, and God, just showers them with the praise and approval. Most stories of kings highlight one abuse or another of power. And they really latched onto this as a way of and tapping into the Bible as a source of authority, which it still was at the time of the American founding, to say, look, God has in mind a different order that isn't necessarily based around the king, and where the power does not reside in the king. And I think that it looks towards the Torah for that. And that there's, so that's certainly one area.
And do you see the idea of individual rights as being an idea that is really sort of nursing from these ideas in the Torah? I mean, it takes it in a slightly different direction, obviously.
No, not rights. No, the Torah speaks about responsibilities, not rights.
Right. That's a massive.
That's a big difference. It's a huge difference, because when you speak about rights, you get to the kind of unhealthy place that I think American civil discourse is today, where there's a competition. I have a right for this, but and it has to be protected, and it's about protecting each person's rights. When you have everyone pulling for their side, pulling for their rights, the question is, who is pulling for the whole? Who is pulling for the common good? Is there a notion of sacrifice for the common good? And I think what the Torah speaks about, the Torah obviously also wants to have an order, a social order that works, speaks much more in terms of responsibilities. If we all fulfill our responsibilities properly, then everything will be in its good working place.
Well, one other question about the hierarchy topic, because, we mentioned obviously earlier the gender hierarchy, but that, is obviously a reflection of the world at large until not so long ago. But I just wanted to ask for a minute about the priestly hierarchy, about Kohanim. I'm curious what you think about why did that remain? Meaning, why did the Torah remain, keep that very clear system of, and I would say religious, right, ritual hierarchy in place?
So I think that it actually dismantled about 90% of it relative to what was going on in the ancient world. Look, elsewhere, so much of the economic produce goes to the temples, and the priests become bankers, and they loan out money. And I would say like this: if let's say you're living in the time of the Tanakh, and you decide, I don't want to be a fireman, I don't want to be a policeman, I want to go somewhere where I can be a priest. Okay, not necessarily a Kohen, but a priest. And so I want to look around at the different cultures and see, where can I get the best deal? Where does it really pay to be a priest? The place that is at the bottom of the list is in Israel, because in the Torah, the as I said earlier, the tithes that we are meant to bring are a tiny fraction of what they were elsewhere, and moreover, it's all written down in the book. It's all there in Sefer Vayikra and Sefer Devarim, so that at no point can a Kohen go to somebody and say, if you want to get close to God, you need to bring more, because we can just open our Sefer Vayikra or Sefer Devarim and say, show me where. This is why it's so important that all of these korbanot are written down in Sefer Vayikra. In other words, beyond the fact that this is the will of the Ribono Shel Olam, that we should bring him this korban and that korban, it also limits the capacity of Kohanim in the times of the Beit HaMikdash of abusing their power and telling people, you need to bring more and more and more and more and more. So, yeah. Yeah.
We also know that once in a while that did happen, but then there were also these ideas of bedek bait, meaning where they would literally sort of go through what's going on, take inventory, see what are people taking. Are people taking things that are not meant to be theirs? Meaning we had also sort of a checks and balances system that was in place. I guess I think it's interesting because I wonder if somehow, we do obviously still have a rabbinic system of authority. And I think that in a healthy rabbinic system, we do have sort of the pull on each side, meaning there is a degree of authority, but to me, in a healthy system, will always remain the autonomy on the side of those, on the other side of that conversation or of that dynamic. And I sort of wonder, obviously the Kohanim and the Torah are not parallel to the rabbinic class of today, but I think that there's maybe interesting parallels there as well. There's a real element of self-sacrifice that comes with being part of that, meaning you're not going into that for the money. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, you're not going into that. I would hope, there obviously is an element of power, but we would hope that in its best form, that relationship is one that, again, they both have expertise, but there also is an autonomy that remains.
Yeah, I have to say something here in defense of rabbinic authority.
Yeah.
something that's unbelievable. It's
Yeah.
unbelievable. It's unbelievable. And I really only discovered this really very much by accident. When I lecture abroad, often at various seminaries and theological schools, Christian, I always like to have, if it's possible, a kind of a QA session with the students. It's great. They often have never
So
met.
interesting. Yeah.
They've never met a rabbi. They've never met somebody from Israel. And this has happened to me on more than one occasion. Discussing rabbinic Judaism, and someone says to me, "Who's your pope?" And I remember the first time I heard this, I was like, thinking to myself, "What? What? Who is my pope?" I mean, hey, I have a beanie on my head. Like, what does that mean? Who is our pope? And then I realized what the question was. The question was, I'm telling them that we have Jews spread out all over the world, and they follow more or less the same laws. Yeah, okay, this one eats kitniyot, this one doesn't. But, in the larger picture, we're all observing more or less the same laws, bound by the same set of books. And what they were asking me was, where does the buck stop? Who makes the decision for you guys? Who's the top of the pyramid? And I was like, we don't have a pope. And it's a remarkable thing.
Right.
Rabbinic authority, throughout the ages has been something that's very natural and just imminent. It's from the ground up.
Yeah, it's a grassroots thing.
It's because people rallied around somebody. We never ever had an election, or very few instances where there were elections for our rabbinic leaders. They were simply natural leaders in the purest form, in the purest way. I think it's a remarkable testimony to the rabbinic system that, in spite of the fact that we were spread out everywhere, that we managed to survive without a pope, without a formal structure of who's the top. And when we've tried to do it back here in Israel now, with the chief rabbinate, sometimes it produces great results, and sometimes some might have some reservations about it too.
Right, but what you're saying is that it's also not really natural to the system. You're saying that that's really it was obviously an Ottoman idea. But what I like about that example you gave, and I hope this isn't like psychoanalyzing my guest as you're with me, but I think that little anecdote was kind of very reflective of a lot of what I feel your scholarship really brings, which is that you gain an outside perspective when studying another culture or meeting another group of people, and then you realize, wait a minute, that reflects something really foundational about like the way, right? I wouldn't have thought about that. I would never have thought about the fact that we don't have a pope, so that really shows how again there is an autonomy that sits at the root even of rabbinic authority, because we are all electing to to live under that and to live with that system of law. I thought that was a really great example. Okay, I guess sort of as we wind down our conversation, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned before an idea that I think is really important. This idea of how in sort of like Western liberal thought, we speak much. There's much more conversation about rights, and in the Torah we have much more of a conversation of responsibility. I just wanted to actually quote you in an article that you wrote where you really expressed a lot of these ideas, and you wrote the following: in its careful use of the second person you, meaning the Torah uses that, it addressed the entire Israelite collective and simultaneously each individual member personally, placing heavy religious and moral obligations upon him. It explained to its recipients that fulfilling these duties would win them an abundance of blessings, while abandoning them would bring disaster. In the end, the dual principles of the responsibility of the community to its citizens, as well as the responsibility of citizens to the community, is not merely an important aspect of the biblical legacy, but also something that our current political and ethical discourse urgently requires. Now, you don't have to reflect on that piece that I read, but I guess I'm curious of all the ideas we've spoken about in our conversation today, what you think might really be important for us to remember now, perhaps to sharpen, perhaps to further develop. I'm not sort of looking for, sort of al-chitz for what our the Jewish world or the state of Israel looks like right now, but I am curious to hear from all of this sort of wisdom, what you think might need tweaking right now, that may be connected to some of the themes we've spoken about today.
Well, I'll take it to just what comes to my mind. Okay, it's just one direction. One could perhaps take it to many. One of the things that really animates me about living here in Eretz Yisrael at this time is that for all the bickering and all the differences, I think that most of us here in Israel feel a sense of responsibility. We're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat, and we're going to have to find some way to work with one another. And it's just so deep in our sources that there's a nation of Israel, and that we all have to be a part of that. And I contrast that with what I see happening in America, where there's also bitter differences. That I don't need to elaborate on that, and I'm sure that our listening audience that lives in America can say much more about that than I can. But what I see that in America is that there's no capacity even to find a common voice, because there's nothing that people share in common. One of the things that Jews share so much in common here in Israel. It's not just the same economic opportunities and the same geopolitical realities and the same language and the same calendar and the same religion. And in America, I don't think Americans have that. America, for all its wonderful graces, is an experiment. What happens when we take people who have nothing to do with one another, and we take them from all over the world, and they don't speak the same language, and they don't have the same religion, and they don't have the same stories, and they don't have the same values, and they don't have the same visions? Can we all come together around something? And that's increasingly becoming challenging. And that's one of the things that I enjoy most about life in Israel. For all of its bitter differences, I think that this is an amazing aspect of life here, and I think you see it now, especially with the hostages. And I've been reflecting. I think anybody of my generation can't help but to reflect on a very similar episode, at least in my lifetime, perhaps not yours, Yosefa, but I still recall in high school when the Iranians took, I think it was 50-something Americans hostage for 444 days. And I remember how Americans responded. It was just like here in some ways, but totally unlike here in other ways. Just like here, it was top of the news every night. It's the reason that Carter lost the 1980 election. But the way in which Americans, from my memory, related to this was, this is an insult to America that we have these people who are prisoners there. This is just an insult to what America is about. I don't remember as in those years a sense of, these are our brothers and sisters. It wasn't something that sat in your gut day in and day out the way it does for everybody in this country. And I think that's because of a very special sense of connectedness that we can't take for granted. It's something that the Torah has carefully nurtured within us. This sense of mutual connection through our history, through a covenant, all of it together. And it is a political consequence of what the Torah has done. This enormously strong sense of national community.
I recently came across a piece from Rabbi Sachs, and he actually gave this language. He said that in Israel, the Jewish people are connected by a community of fate, meaning we share a common fate with each other. And he says that outside of Israel, the Jewish communities share a community of faith, meaning they have an, emunah b'Hashem or emunah in Chayei Torah, and they rally together in communities surrounding a shared faith. But if I could just reflect on the side of the fate, I agree with you that I think it's actually much more than that. Meaning it's true that we share a goral. It was a version, sort of a spin-off of Rav Soloveitchik's idea of fate and destiny. I think that I agree with you. It's much more than just a shared fate, meaning there is a shared, as you said, a brotherhood, right? And I think that, by the way, sometimes what becomes the most painful points or sort of the fault lines in Israel is because we assume that we should share so many assumptions with each other, but we don't always share those same assumptions. And so that often becomes sort of the tense points between us. But I agree, there's definitely, out of all the tremendous pain that we have experienced in the past year and a half, and obviously much longer before that, but in the past year and a half much more acutely, there's also the depth of connection that really has come through in that as well. Rabbi, Professor Joshua Berman, I want to thank you for coming back on the podcast. Always an honor and a pleasure, and for sharing and reflecting on ideas that are, relate to much broader than this week's parsha, but I think also many of which really sit at the root also of what we're going to be learning about in this week and the weeks that come. So thank you so much.
Okay. My pleasure. I look forward to visiting again. And once again, you should go from strength to strength, Michael V'Chayal, on this 200th anniversary of the podcast.
Amen. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.